Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about one of the most interesting periods in Japanese history, the Ashikaga Shogunate, also known as the Muromachi Shogunate. Now this was a time when the Ashikaga family rose to power, ruling Japan as a military dictatorship from their base in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. Even though the official dates of their rule stretch from 1336 to 1588, their real power started to crumble way earlier, around the 1520s. By 1573, the Ashikaga family was pushed out of Kyoto altogether. One of the key figures during the height of the Ashikaga Shogunate was Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who held the title of shogun from 1449 to 1473. Yoshimasa's time as shogun, especially the years after he stepped down, was a turning point. It was during this era that Japan's fine arts, like painting, tea ceremonies, and architecture flourished. But his rule wasn't all peaceful. His final years saw a series of political and military crises that eventually led to the devastating Onin War, which stretched from 1467 to 1477. The Ashikaga family's roots go way back to the 12th century, when a man named Minamoto Yoshiyasu adopted the name Ashikaga after their residence. Yoshiyasu's grandfather, Minamoto Yoshie, was a legendary warrior during the later 3 Years' War in the late 11th century. Fast forward 6 generations, and we get to Ashikaga Takauji, the first shogun of the Ashikaga Shogunate, who ruled from 1338 to 1358. Now, the story of how Takauji became shogun is pretty wild. At the time, Emperor Go-Daigo had been exiled for plotting against the Kamakura Shogunate, the ruling military government. But Go-Daigo wasn't one to give up easily. He gathered loyal supporters and tried to overthrow the Kamakura. Interestingly, he put his hopes in Ashikaga Takauji, who had a history of rebelling against the shogunate himself. Takauji was tasked with leading an army to crush the emperor's enemies, but halfway through, he switched sides and supported Go-Daigo instead. He marched his troops to Kyoto, ousted the Kamakura Shogunate, and helped kick off what's known as the Kenmu Restoration. But here's where it gets messy. Power struggles started breaking out between Takauji and another warlord named Nitta Yoshisada. At the same time, Emperor Go-Daigo's reputation took a hit due to some pretty poor decision-making and failures to support his allies. Takauji eventually marched back to Kyoto in 1336, forcing Go-Daigo to flee to Yoshino in the south, where he established a rival imperial court. In 1338, Takauji officially established the Ashikaga Shogunate in Kyoto. He handled military power, while his brother Ashikaga Tadayoshi managed the bureaucracy and judicial matters. This new government created a split in the imperial family, with the Kyoto-based court supporting the shogunate, and Go-Daigo's court still holding on in Yoshino. It wasn't until 1392 that the conflict ended, and the two courts were reunited under a single emperor. Takauji's leadership wasn't without its challenges though. His relationship with his brother Tadayoshi fell apart when Tadayoshi tried to seize Kyoto in 1351. Takauji eventually forced him out, and Tadayoshi fled to Kamakura, where he mysteriously died, likely poisoned. Takauji remained in control until his death in 1358, leaving the shogunate to his son Yoshiakira. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who became shogun in 1369, was another major figure during this era. He was a brilliant strategist and managed to consolidate a lot of power by building alliances with powerful regional families. He rotated the role of military governor among loyal clans like the Hosokawa, Hatakeyama, and Shiba. There are even theories that Yoshimitsu wanted to start his own dynasty, because, at one point, he stopped ruling in the name of the emperor. He even forced court nobles to perform menial tasks to show who was really in charge. Yoshimitsu's biggest achievement was ending the split between the northern and southern courts in 1392. He persuaded the southern emperor to return to Kyoto, which brought some much-needed stability. But Yoshimitsu also had to put down rebellions, like the Meitoku Rebellion of 1391, and the Oe Rebellion in 1400. led by Aochi Yoshihiro. Aochi, who was frustrated with the Ashikaga family, didn't want to contribute to building a lavish villa for the shogun. That rebellion fell apart pretty quickly though, after Yoshihiro's allies betrayed him. In his later years, Yoshimitsu focused on trade and diplomacy. He established a trade relationship with China, and made a fortune importing copper, which was essential for Japan's currency at the time. He even stirred up controversy by referring to himself as the King of Japan in a letter to the Chinese emperor. Beyond politics, Yoshimitsu was a huge patron of the arts, supporting painters, potters, and even landscape gardeners. Many artists from his time were inspired by Chinese styles, which became known as the Karayo style in Japan. After Yoshimitsu stepped down, his son Ashikaga Yoshimochi took over as shogun in 1395. Yoshimochi's rule and that of his successor Yoshikazu marked a period when the Kanto region of Japan began slipping out of the shogunate's control. Yoshimitsu's nephew, Yoshinori, later took over as shogun in 1428. Yoshinori was an interesting figure. He had been a Buddhist monk since childhood, but had to leave monastic life after being called to lead the shogunate. With his background, he was determined to bring justice to the poorer classes and strengthen the shogunate's hold on the military. Unfortunately, Yoshinori's strict rule and perceived arrogance made him unpopular among the nobles. In 1441, he was assassinated by a general named Akamatsu Mitsusuke, an event known as the Kakitsu incident. Mitsusuke didn't escape punishment though. He was hunted down and forced to commit suicide. After Yoshinori's death, his oldest son Yoshikatsu briefly became shogun, but he only ruled for 2 years before passing away. This left the shogunate without a leader until Yoshikatsu's younger brother, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, took over at just 13 years old in 1449, and when the Ashikaga Shogunate was already beginning to crumble. Widespread food shortages and starvation were gripping the country, but Yoshimasa wasn't particularly interested in politics or solving these crises. Instead, his passion lay in art and culture, where he left a significant legacy. Yoshimasa's disinterest in leadership would prove costly. At 29 years old, with no children of his own, he appointed his younger brother Yoshimi as his successor and prepared for a comfortable retirement. That plan unraveled quickly. In 1465, Yoshimasa's wife, Hino Tomoko, gave birth to a son. Tomoko insisted their son should become the next shogun, setting off a power struggle between factions loyal to Yoshimi and those supporting the infant heir. What began as a family dispute in 1467 escalated into a full-blown conflict known as the Onin War. Kyoto became the central battlefield, and the fighting grew so intense that much of the city's historic architecture, including temples and residences, was reduced to ashes. Initially, it seemed like a dynastic squabble, but before long, it evolved into a proxy war between two major warlords in western Japan, Yamano Mochitoyo, who supported Tomoko and the infant, and Hosokawa Katsumoto, who backed Yoshimi. The Onin War was less about solving the succession crisis and more about exposing the shogunate's weakness. Military governors, or daimyo, who were meant to serve the shogun, used the chaos to assert their own power. Both Yamana and Hosokawa, the key figures in the war, eventually died during the conflict, but no side made any real effort to restore peace. The fighting dragged on for 10 long years, leaving Kyoto devastated and its people in despair. By 1473, Yoshimasa, perhaps fed up with the turmoil, officially stepped down as shogun and handed the position to his son, Yoshihisa. But the war didn't end until 1477, when the factions simply ran out of resources and energy to continue. There was no decisive victory, no formal truce, just exhaustion. By this point, the Ashikaga Shogunate's political and military authority had been utterly discredited. Yoshimasa retreated to a quieter life in the Higashiyama district of Kyoto, where he turned his focus entirely to the arts. He built an elegant villa that would later become known as Jinkakuji, or the Silver Pavilion, and surrounded himself with painters, potters and actors. He also played a major role in refining the Japanese tea ceremony, transforming it into the highly ritualized practice still admired today. This cultural renaissance, often called the Higashiyama period, stands in stark contrast to the chaos of the Onin War. Yoshimasa died on January 27, 1490, leaving behind a legacy that's still debated today. While he nurtured a golden age for Japanese art and aesthetics, his lack of leadership plunged the country further into turmoil. His son, Yoshihisa, had been shogun since 1474, but ruled for only a short time, dying in 1489. Yoshimasa's attempt to bring stability through succession by appointing Yoshimi's son, Yoshitane, as the next shogun, didn't reverse the decline. Yoshitane's rule, which began in 1490, marked the beginning of the end for the Ashikaga Shogunate. By now the family's grip on power was tenuous at best. Yoshitane's cousin, Yoshizumi, became shogun in 1495, but his reign was brief, and the long gaps between leaders revealed the growing irrelevance of the position. The role of shogun had become little more than a title, with regional warlords controlling their own territories like independent rulers. Yoshizumi's son Yoshiharu took up the mantle in 1522 at the age of 11. But like his predecessors, Yoshiharu struggled to maintain authority, ruling until 1547 when he passed leadership to his son Yoshiteru. Yoshiteru's reign ended tragically when he was murdered in 1565, further exposing the power vacuum in the country. His cousin Yoshihide took over briefly but ruled for less than a year before dying in 1568. The final Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki, came to power in 1568 under extraordinary circumstances. Before becoming shogun, Yoshiaki had been an abbot at a Buddhist monastery in Nara, far removed from politics. But with his family's decline, he renounced his monastic life and tried to rally what little support the Ashikaga clan had left. Unfortunately, Yoshiaki's leadership coincided with the meteoric rise of Oda Nobunaga, one of the most formidable warlords in Japanese history. In early 1573, Nobunaga attacked Kyoto, burning much of the city and driving Yoshiaki into exile. Later that year, in August, Nobunaga struck again, forcing Yoshiaki out of Kyoto for good. With his defeat, the Ashikaga Shogunate effectively came to an end. Yoshiaki formally abdicated in 1588, and returned to life as a Buddhist priest. By then the shogunate had long since lost its ability to govern, and powerful warlords like Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu took center stage, ushering in a new era of Japanese history. The Ashikaga Shogunate remains a deeply debated period. Ashikaga Takauji, the founder, was once criticized for opposing Emperor Go-Daigo, but many now credit him with bringing stability during an otherwise turbulent time. Yoshimasa, on the other hand, is remembered as a brilliant patron of the arts, but an ineffective ruler whose negligence allowed the country to spiral into civil war. By the late 1500s, Japan was left fractured, and it wasn't until Tokugawa Ieyasu seized power in 1603 that the nation found stability once again. The Ashikaga era, for all its failures, laid the groundwork for the cultural traditions and political developments that shaped Japan's future.